Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at pcntv.com.
Welcome to PCN's On the Road College Election Panel. Today I am at the University of Scranton. We're joined by a panel of esteemed guests as well as a panel of students that are here to participate in our discussion. And we'd like to talk a little bit about what's coming up over the next 2 months as we head into our election coverage. Once again, one of the most important parts of our conversation is really to involve our students and hear what your perspectives are as we head into this election season. Let's get things kicked off by introducing our esteemed panel. Our first guest is Dr. JoyAnna Hopper. She's co-director of the University of Scranton Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service. Also, Borys Krawczeniuk. He's an investigative reporter with the Scranton Times-Tribune. And Jeff Brauer, Keystone College professor of political science. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, as we head in, we're roughly about 2 months away from Election Day. Pennsylvanians will go to the polls on November 8th to elect a governor, a U.S. senator, along with members of Congress and their General Assembly. What do you think are the biggest issues that are of importance to our voters driving them to go to the polls? Jeff, why don't you start us off?
Well, I think, for each of the races, there's different issues that will motivate voters to go to the polls. Certainly at the statewide level, the economy, I think, remains a very, very important issue that's going to get people out to the polls. Inflation, for sure, which has been hitting regular folks very hard. We're seeing in lots of other special elections across the country, more so recently, that the recent Supreme Court case of Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade and sent abortion rights back to the states to decide. I think that will be a very big issue that we will see, certainly here in Pennsylvania. So I think at least those are some of the issues at the moment. We can get into some more. Let's see what Borys has to say.
I would agree with that. The economy is the number one issue. The polling shows a little bit of concern about government and politicians. I'm not sure what that's about. And the abortion ruling certainly has made a difference in the race. As Jeff said, it's shown up in other special elections across the country, and there's a lot of signs that in Pennsylvania there's a lot more women registering to vote now than there were in previous elections.
JoyAnna?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think inflation, abortion, probably the top two issues. There have been some interesting polls that have come out recently that have showed that abortion is actually maybe the top reason that people are excited to go to the poll, or looking to go to the polls in November, which is showing that inflation, while important, may be secondary to some voters in some of these races, which could change things up. I also think you have a midterm election where other candidates have been centered. So, for example, former President Trump, he's gone campaigning with various candidates across the country, and that certainly centers him in the race as well, along with, of course, the incumbent President Biden. And so depending upon how connected those individuals are seen to being to candidates, that can also make a difference in races like these as well.
In roughly the past week, both former President Trump as well as President Biden held events in this region. What is it about this area in particular that makes it an important place to, perhaps be considered a bellwether?
So Pennsylvania, I think it is really truly split in terms of the presence of Republicans and Democrats. Where we used to look at Ohio, Florida as sort of these bellwethers, we're now really looking to places like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, like Wisconsin. And I think this area in particular is also a good example of that. You have one of the more competitive congressional districts in this area. You have, like I said, representation of both Democrats and Republicans. Races, the margins tend to be pretty close in Pennsylvania. And also you're talking about a seat, Senate seat in particular, that could be very important in determining who controls the Senate and potentially also whether or not certain kinds of democratic policies would be able to pass.
In Northeast Pennsylvania, we've long had far more Democrats than Republicans, and that started to change in 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump. What you saw is the conversion of a lot of what we used to call Reagan and Casey Democrats after President Ronald Reagan and Governor Bob Casey, the conservative Democrats, to Republicans. And that has shaved a lot of the margin, the Democratic advantage in both Luzerne and Lackawanna counties away. There are a lot more Republicans now than there were. So this is a swing area. This is where voters really move around based on the election, and that's why they were both here. Biden is trying to regain that for the Democrats, and Trump is trying to make sure it doesn't change for the Republicans. It's really become an election with Biden's speech last week in Philadelphia about the two of them. Biden thinks he can take Trump out again, and that's what he's trying to turn this election to, him against Trump again.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. That, Pennsylvania and certainly northeastern PA is such an important area because we are swing voters. And both Trump and Biden, Biden's from northeastern PA, which is, so it's one of his home areas. We look at the last two presidential elections in Pennsylvania, and the margin between the candidates was very, very close, very slim. So Pennsylvania has become one of the most important, swing areas in the country as well. So this is a midterm election. So it's an election and it's the first midterm election for President Biden. So we always talk about in political science whether people see it as a choice election. Is it a choice between the candidates, or is it this referendum on the president and the president's party? And most often it ends up being a referendum on the president and the president's party. Although with Donald Trump, still being on the scene, and with all the troubles that he's been going through, and the fact that he's going out and campaigning for all these candidates, he himself is making it more of a choice election than we've ever really seen, certainly in recent memory. And certainly, again, the abortion issue is also making it a choice election. So I think we're going to see a very different midterm turnout, very different midterm results than we've seen in decades in this particular election.
Jeff, as you mentioned, midterm elections typically tend to favor the party opposite the party in power. Do you think that happens this year?
Yeah, I mean, all the indications early on and all the polling early on months ago was indicating that it was going to be a pretty strong year for Republicans, the party that's out of power, the White House. But more recently, things have been slowly turning around, and we're seeing that in the generic polling, that the Democrats are starting to have an advantage over the Republicans. As we already mentioned, in a lot of these special elections that we've seen in the last couple of months, Democrats who were not supposed to win or maybe even be close, they're winning elections. So I think there's going to be a different look, a different turn in this election cycle than we've seen in recent midterms.
How much will public opinion of President Biden or former President Donald Trump have on how people vote this time around?
I would say that, generally speaking, public opinion about the incumbent would have a significant effect, especially with high inflation and some economic issues. As the panelists have said, those things tend to be fundamentally important in determining midterm elections. What is unusual is the fact that opinion about Trump will also likely matter here. That certain candidates, especially those that have really vocally attached themselves to Trump, they are going to be judged based on people's feelings and opinions about the former president, which I do think is fairly unusual. I will say, also sort of continuing off of what Jeff was talking about, one of the things that really changed was abortion sort of becoming a more prominent issue, especially, as I was mentioning, with some of those polls that are showing maybe people actually are going to the polls because of abortion this time around. That really changes the dynamic in a way that, even as political scientists, we don't we tend to think of the economy as being the defining factor. And so this changes things in a way that makes it really difficult for us to know what the effects are actually going to be. Generally speaking, we expect the Republicans to do fairly well when the economy, has some struggles. President is of the opposite party. But with the Dobbs decision, and also certain things like the student loan policy decision, other things that are sort of happening one after the other, it is becoming more difficult to tell whether or not the economy is really what's going to determine this and how well Republicans will do. I would be hesitant to say that they will do very poorly because of these decisions, but I do think, as Jeff pointed out, it will make some changes to what we would normally expect.
The interesting thing about Pennsylvania so far has been that ever since, even before the primary, the Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate and governor have had large polling leads. Now that's going to tighten up in the next couple of weeks. That always does after Labor Day as more people start paying attention. But the Democrats are in pretty good shape in Pennsylvania right now. Now we got 2 months to the election, so various factors can affect that. But they're surprisingly strong candidates, and Trump has not been able, even though Trump endorsed Doug Mastriano for governor and Mehmet Oz for the Senate, he has not been able to pull them along so far. And that could be part of the reason he decided to have a rally in Northeast Pennsylvania, that and the 8th Congressional District race.
As you mentioned, former President Trump had the endorsement rally as we record this past weekend. Are voters swayed by endorsements?
By his.
Well, well, certainly there's been indication that Donald Trump has been fairly persuasive as an endorser, particularly when it comes to the primary, with Republican primary voters. And, that's why Mehmet Oz was able to eke out a primary victory. I mean, it's pretty clear when we looked at the data that it was Trump's endorsement, which was able to get him over the edge over, a very strong candidate in McCormick. And same with Doug Mastriano. I mean, that was a very wide open field, and again, his endorsements seem to make the difference, and certainly in the primaries. The question is whether his endorsements make a difference in the general. It's been very mixed with that. We've got to remember that President Trump wasn't able to win Pennsylvania in 2020, and he barely eked it out in 2016. So, that's still up for grabs. So, but overall, endorsements usually don't make that much of a difference. When we look at it from a political science point of view, but Trump has been an anomaly in that sense, especially within his own party.
How has former President Trump changed the Republican Party?
You got like 4 hours for that one.
How's it changed the party? Well, it's certainly more even more conservative, I think, than it was, and it's conservative on different issues. Much more conservative on immigration, much more conservative on even abortion, and those types of issues. Economically, I mean, I think the tax cuts and cutting regulations still remains kind of a hallmark of the Republican Party, but those immigration and crime now, that's always been a Republican standard too. But immigration and abortion, those are the two that you do not sway elections. And he made it in 2016 and 2018 about immigration was a big part of that, and I think we're going to find out about abortion, exactly how much influence it has, because it's never one of the issues that gets named in polling as one of the top issues. That's one of the really interesting things about this election.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I certainly think that it has shown us some of the cleavages that existed within the Republican Party, that maybe the Republican Party had been able to hide a little bit better than the Democrats have. It showed us that some of the caucuses within the Republican Party were maybe not as in line with one another as we might have thought, and so I mean, I don't think that this necessarily started just because of Donald Trump, but I do think that the Republican Party has been sort of in flux ideologically, figuring out what kind of policies they want to focus on, whether they're more interested in cultural issues or whether they're more interested in economic issues. I think that there's been some shifting there, and some of that shifting, I think, has been painful in that it has revealed some of these cleavages within the party. So I'm not willing to say that Donald Trump was the only reason that that happened, but I do think he kind of, for lack of better phrase, sort of blew things up in a way that really showed where some of those cleavages existed.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump was able to attract new folks to the Republican Party, right? I mean, he brought in a lot of Democrats, right? Especially in the rural areas, and we certainly saw that in Pennsylvania. You know, the Democrats have had a registration edge in Pennsylvania for a very long time, and that edge was almost 1 million at one point, over 1 million at one point. In 2016 it was like 900,000. Now it's down to about 750,000, and a lot of that is movement from former Democrats, more working class Democrats, rural Democrats that have moved to the Trump camp, moved to the Republican Party, mostly because of Trump. And I don't know if it was somebody else that they would do that. You know, for me, that the biggest thing that Trump has changed in the Republican Party is the Republican Party used to be a very institutionalist party, like believed in the institutions of our democracy, of our government, of the state. And he's totally reversed that, turned that around, that now Republicans, particularly MAGA Trump Republicans, Make America Great Again Republicans, don't trust institutions and attack institutions. Donald Trump is always attacking the media and is always attacking the courts and now the FBI and law enforcement and what he calls the deep state, the whole bureaucracy. And, that's completely opposite of what Republicans stood for decades. In fact, it's more like what radical lefties stood for back in the 60s and 50s and 60s and 70s, right? So it's kind of inside out in that sense. And I think that's really, to me, the most dramatic change that Trump has brought to the Republican Party.
What do all of you make of candidates who attempt to discredit the credibility of the traditional media?
Boris, you can
I should
answer
take
that.
that one.
Yeah.
So you want that?
Well, I mean, we've got a Republican governor candidate, Doug Mastriano, who does not talk to the traditional media, which we are finding highly unusual. In fact, he actually puts people between himself and the traditional media. I've never seen this. It is an experiment in determining what influence the traditional media still have left, because a lot of towns don't have newspapers anymore, and newspaper circulation has declined in a lot of places, including here. So it is definitely a different approach to the campaign. Why he can't answer questions from what he considers weak reporters, I don't understand, but that's the strategy he has chosen so far, and it kind of flies in the face of the idea that he needed to expand his base after the primary. He had a very strong showing in the Republican primary, won by 2-1 over the next closest contender, who happens to be from Northeast Pennsylvania. But he needs to go get independents and some Democrats and to win in Pennsylvania, and it's not clear that he's doing that to me. So I would think you would talk to the traditional media a little bit. Maybe he will later on, but so far, nope.
What is the greater impact of that?
I don't know. I don't know what it will be. If he wins, boy, that'll be really, really, really interesting for us.
JoyAnna, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that the media within a democracy is crucial. In order for us to be able to hold elected officials accountable, we rely on media sources to tell us what's going on, what the candidates, what their various proposals are, where they lie on particular issues. And so when candidates refuse to talk to the media, it really weakens that mechanism that's important within a democracy for us to be able to hold elected officials accountable. If a candidate doesn't speak to the media and then they get elected and we don't really have much of a concept of what they think on issues or what they plan to do, how are we as voters to be able to hold them accountable? And so I do think that that's problematic. I think that it is possible now in a way that it wasn't possible because you do have many alternatives beyond traditional media at this point. Social media, just the internet, broadly speaking, has allowed many different outlets. And so whereas I think candidates maybe didn't have a choice as to whether they spoke to the media in the past, now they can pick and choose who they speak to, and in that way they can also reframe their messaging entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. And, our friends like Borys here are extremely important. Most of the information we get about elections, about policy stances, candidates, all that stuff is through the media. And the media also helps shape attitudes about our system and democracy. So they're extremely important. And we're talking about Doug Mastriano here, he's the one candidate who's not speaking to the media, which again is very strange and unusual. And I was talking to a national reporter the other day because I do a lot of national interviews, and she is at her wit's end with Mastriano, and she actually is a right-leaning journalist, right? And Mastriano's people is literally said to her, well, you haven't written anything nice about me yet, so we're not going to talk to you. And, that's very, very dangerous in a democracy, very dangerous in a system like this. And, of course, this all really started with Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the one who made it, in vogue, made it popular to attack the media, made it popular to make the media the enemy of the state. Political scientists, we don't always get along with the media either, right? Because we do similar jobs, but Trump, we respect each other.
But Trump talked to the traditional media. Yeah. He did the infamous interview with 60 Minutes. He always talked to the New York Times, and even though he criticized them endlessly. Mastriano seems to be afraid of traditional media. I'm just not sure why. And he's the only one among the current candidates. I mean, the Republican Oz is accusing Fetterman of hiding out from the media, but I know that Fetterman's not really been afraid of the media. Maybe he's afraid of showing whether or not he's healthy now. But Mastriano makes a point of avoiding the media, and the danger of this is that he talks, and he actually does talk to the media, but only the friendly media. So he doesn't take. He's not facing tough questions. He talks to the media that think like he does, or that the conservative outlets that think like he does, and that's really bad because it doesn't allow you to test your ideas, and it's not the free marketplace of ideas that this country was founded on. We end up in this echo chamber where you only talk to people who agree with you, and then when anything gets done in this country, it's actually compromising with both sides compromising to get something done. I don't see, he'll have a friendly House and a friendly Senate if he gets elected, but I'll bet you there'll be Republicans who don't like some of the things he wants to do because he hasn't really road tested the ideas.
Let's move on. Will Bunch of the Philadelphia Inquirer had written that candidates tend to move more toward the center following the primary election. Do you see evidence of this happening, particularly with our statewide candidates for U.S. Senate and governor, and is it a successful strategy?
I don't think we're seeing it as much as you would expect to see it. Certainly, I think Mastriano is a good example of that. I don't think that he is moving towards the center. It can be. I think in a place like Pennsylvania, moving towards the center can be effective if you know that you need to capture the votes of independents, if you know that you need to have some from the other party voting for you. Certainly, that is something that we expect. But I think that in some situations, candidates are now being rewarded for being on the extremes. And so that is dissuading them from sort of moving to the middle. And I think we have a couple of statewide candidates that are good examples of that.
I think Oz has moderated. I think Fetterman has moderated. Both were much more, Oz has taken down a lot of the references to Trump from his website. Fetterman is talking about how he was tough on crime in Braddock when he was the mayor there, and because he's been criticized for being soft on crime as a member of the State Pardons Board. So I think there is, but you don't see that. You haven't seen that, and certainly Shapiro has. Shapiro's acting at times acts more like a Republican than a Democrat, but not Mastriano.
Yeah, I would agree. I certainly at the gubernatorial race, we have not seen it. Definitely not Mastriano. Shapiro has always been in the middle anyways. I mean, he was never very much of a lefty guy, and he runs from the middle. He runs as a Pennsylvanian. He runs away from the national party. You know, his favorite, if you listen to his interviews, his favorite thing to say is he doesn't listen to Washington, D.C. He listens to Washington County, Pennsylvania. Right? So he's definitely has always run and governed from the middle, and he is fairly like a centrist,
moderate,
liberal,
yeah.
moderate Republican at one point when we used to have them. And I absolutely agree that I think in the Fetterman and Oz race, they have both moved towards the middle in a lot of issues. Oz, in the primary, the Republican primary was one of the craziest primaries I've ever seen. And there's so much money that was spent, so much attacking each other. And I think that's one of the reasons why Oz is having such a hard time really bringing the party together. But he's running a pretty traditional campaign and a pretty centrist campaign. He's out on the road, talking to people, working with people. Where Fetterman has not been able to because of his health, and he also hasn't been, as Borys mentioned, hasn't been talking to the media not nearly as much as he used to. But Fetterman has definitely gone towards the middle too, especially with things like environmental issues, with fracking, which is an important issue in Pennsylvania, even here in northeastern Pennsylvania. He's certainly moderated his views on fracking. So, and it's helpful, and it's certainly helpful, and that's traditional political science is if you want to win general elections, you got to move towards the middle.
As we get into digging a little deeper in some of the issues that we're interested in, once again, I'd like to invite our student audience to join us and participate. And I'd like to hear what issues you're interested in, and in particular, if there are any issues that the candidates are not talking about that you'd like to hear a little bit more about. So the first issue I'd like to bring up is something that may be of high interest to our participants today, and that's student debt forgiveness. In August, President Biden announced a student debt forgiveness program. Can you talk a little bit about how that's being perceived and whether or not it's being politicized?
I think it's been perceived in a couple of different ways. There is certainly a group of voters who has student debt, who has been interested in this issue in particular because it affects them directly. And, for them, this was something that Biden sort of initially campaigned on finding a way to do this. Other candidates previously had campaigned on trying to find ways to offer forgiveness, overhaul the student loan system in some capacity, lower the cost of a college education. And so there was some expectations that Biden would do something, and he sort of kept saying, okay, at this point I'll make a decision, and that deadline kept getting kind of further and further away. But you also have a part of the country who perceives this as you took out student loan debt and you should pay it back. And I had to pay back my debts, right? Not saying me, but hypothetically, I have to pay back my debts, so you should have to pay back yours. And seeing it as an issue of fairness. And I think that it's been sold both ways, and I think that there are certainly populations that believe both of those things, and it will be a question of whether or not this is something that invigorates young people who may be very likely to have student loan debt or be concerned about it, that they would then show up to vote, since young people tend to not be the most reliable voting bloc, unfortunately.
I mean, I would add to that too. I mean, part of the division is not just folks who have paid their debt back and all that, is like folks who didn't go to college, right? And a lot of Republican voters in particular, Trump voters in particular, are non-college educated, more blue-collar type of workers, rural workers. And it's probably an issue that's going to resonate with them, right, in the sense of where there's fairness that these folks who decided to go to college, they're getting this extra help. Where's our extra help, right? So there's definitely a class issue that comes along with this. There's no doubt, though, that we've seen already in the polls that it's motivated young people to migrate even more towards the Democratic Party, more towards thinking that Joe Biden's kind of okay guy, right? Joe Biden's poll numbers have been fairly low. More recently they've edged up with some of his legislative accomplishments, and of course with this student debt issue. So people are not super excited about Joe Biden for the most part, but we call them the meh voters, but they're starting to lean towards the Dems, which they haven't been for the last couple of years.
What's interesting about this issue is how much it's been politicized, given how small the relief is.
Yeah.
It's at the most you could get $20,000 of your tuition forgiven, and everybody in this room knows that one semester of college costs more than that, or can cost more than that, depending on where you go to school. So it's not really a lot of money, but everything gets politicized, especially in an election year like this one. And this, we're seeing the results. Will it matter? We'll see.
Mm-hmm. I will follow up on that just quickly. I think the actual forgiveness portion, $10,000, $20,000, really took away from some of the other parts of the executive action that may have more impact. So adjusting the income-based repayment plans to be 5% of discretionary income, and actually changing the percentage that's used to determine what discretionary income actually is, making some adjustments to the way that interest works so that interest can't sort of compile over time. These are things that probably will have more effect for more people and in the long term, but were really overshadowed by the $10,000, $20,000 forgiveness. And so I'm not sure if that was, the best approach from the Biden administration, because I think they probably would have been able to get more support from a larger group of people by really focusing on that part of the plan as opposed to that small level of forgiveness.
Let's move on and talk again about abortion access. Did this earlier Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade energize any particular block of voters that one party benefits perhaps more than another?
Yes. I would say this is going to, and it has energized women. Young, unmarried women in particular tend to be more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. This will energize them, likely get them to the polls. One of the panelists, I think, mentioned at one point that we've seen more women registering to vote. I think certainly from the Republican standpoint, there is a concern that this issue in particular may bring out additional voters for Democrats, but also it could have an effect on women who are independents and sort of force them into voting for more Democrats. I think the Kansas election is a really good example of that, where you see a referendum where in a fairly conservative state, you saw overwhelming support for protecting abortion rights. And so that, in some way, is giving us an indication that, there may be some effects of that decision that are long-lasting.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's bringing independents more towards the Democratic camp. We're seeing that in the polls very clearly. I think here in Pennsylvania, we not only look towards northeastern PA because we are the center of the political universe, right? It's a great place to be a reporter and a political scientist, and I have a great career here. But the suburbs of Philadelphia are also one of the major swing areas, counties like Delaware County and Montgomery County, which is where Shapiro is from, and Chester County. And they traditionally were Republicans, but more moderate Republicans. But over the last decade or so, they have shifted, and some of the counties have shifted entirely to become more Democratic. And those folks, that's where we're going to see really the motivation on this issue. The suburban women in those more affluent counties outside of Philadelphia, that at one time voted Republican, and more recently they're voting Democrat, and now they're definitely going to come out and vote Democrats, particularly on this issue. And it's going to give a major advantage to both Fetterman and Shapiro, who are, standing up for abortion rights. Oz has become a little more quiet on it as he's moved towards the middle, and Mastriano is doubling down and saying that if he becomes governor, that we're going to ban abortion pretty much in every case here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, but even he's not talking about it as much because he's afraid of what it might mean. It was a key issue for him in the primary, and you don't hear him talk about it anymore.
But it's still on his website.
Is it?
Borys, you wrote earlier in the year that the state legislature passed a bill that, if approved again next session, would lead to a referendum that could ban abortions in Pennsylvania. What do you hear from your readers on this issue?
I honestly haven't talked to them a lot, but I do know that the issue is motivating voters, and whether or not that actually happens, because there is a lawsuit challenging that. But it's definitely an issue. I have a consultant friend of mine who says he's seen that independently registered women moved by 20 points toward the Democrats, which is not a lot of voters because independents only make up about 15% of the state electorate. But in a close election, it could really matter.
Let's move on now. Republican candidate for governor Doug Mastriano has been characterized as a Christian nationalist. What does that mean?
I just read about this, and he denies it. But it's basically America first, and America is a Christian country. That's the substance of it. Because the founders were Christians, and we should put the country first. You meld those two, and then you get Christian nationalism. And anybody who disagrees with that, woe unto them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and nationalism is this idea that certain groups of people are the best people, better than other people, and it goes back to the immigration issue that Borys talked about earlier. This idea that we don't want outsiders coming, that this is a traditionally Judeo-Christian white country, and there's some elements of white supremacy that go along with this concept. So it's one of the reasons why he's denying it, but there's certainly evidence in his past that he's embraced a lot of these ideas.
Let's move on and talk about election integrity for a moment. There are candidates who are currently running who deny the validity of the 2020 election. If such individuals are elected into office, what does this mean for the upcoming presidential race in 2024?
Boy, that's a great question.
That's a good question, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it could be dangerous. Many of these individuals, within state legislatures, for example, if you have individuals who do not believe that the election results in 2020 were valid, and they want to push their legislature to, ensure that that state legislature has the power to decide which electors they send to Congress, for example, which is something that the Supreme Court is going to be looking at in its next term, whether or not that is constitutional or not. That's something that could end up in a situation where voters in a state vote one way and the state legislature in some way overrides that vote. That is possible. I think maybe even more so are, who are your secretaries of state that are getting voted into office? Do they believe in the integrity of the vote? Who are your election judges? People at the local level who are actually dealing directly with elections. These individuals are going to become very important, and if they believe that votes are fraudulent, it's possible that at the least they'll put that out there to try to dissuade the public from believing what the votes say. But at worst, they would challenge the vote and potentially, try to in any way ensure that the vote says what they want it to. Elections, we don't have democracy if we don't trust the electoral process.
Yeah, I would just add, the Secretary of State position has become politicized, throughout the country. And, I've been teaching political science for like 25 years, and we used to just talk about the Secretary of State as being a very administrative position. They keep the Great Seal of the state, they run elections, they certify elections. It's never usually that controversial. Although in 2000, in George Bush and Gore, they became controversial in Florida. But that was unusual. But now it's becoming politicized. And here in Pennsylvania, in a lot of places, it is an elected position. But here in Pennsylvania, it's appointed by the governor. And we already have, Josh, and this is one of the issues that we're hearing between Josh Shapiro and Doug Mastriano, is who they would appoint to be Secretary of State to certify the election. And, Josh Shapiro has been very clear that he would appoint someone who's simply going to count the votes and tally the votes, and whoever wins, wins. And Doug Mastriano, again, who has been an election denier and doesn't believe that Trump lost, and believes that the Secretary of State could be somebody that could just appoint whoever he wants to win the state. Which again is extremely dangerous.
I think as a practical matter, the issue will be more of a practical thing, where Republicans already, including Mastriano, are already talking about eliminating mail-in ballots, eliminating drop boxes, narrowing when the votes are counted, which votes count, and which mail-in ballots counts if they can't get mail-in ballots banned altogether. And voter ID is going to make a strong return. Mastriano wants to implement that. Now he has some a bit more unconventional, shall we say, ideas like making everybody re-register. That will never fly. Some court along the way will knock that up. But certainly the Republicans are scared by the fact that mail-in voting has been good for Democrats in Pennsylvania, and you're going to see them try to narrow that again.
Particularly considering our statewide races for U.S. Senate and Governor, how important are debates, and do you expect to see debates in either of these races?
Well, Mastriano said that he's not going to debate, and Fetterman says he's not going to debate. So at the moment, it seems like we're not going to see debates. Mm-hmm. But debates are extremely important. They don't necessarily change people's minds, and people who watch debates and go to debates usually are there, and they kind of already have their minds made up. But it does create a sense of enthusiasm and for your supporters, and it does give us, the public at large, and the media, more in-depth answers when it comes to policy. It allows us to see if they can, lead in the moment, how well they can speak and think on their feet. It shows a lot of, transparency and trust issues, how relatable they are to people. And it does sometimes change people's minds. So I think they've been an important tradition in American government, but I'm not sure we're going to see them this time around.
It's remarkable that we may not see them, but I think that Mastriano proposed a debate system where he would pick a moderator, Shapiro would pick a moderator, and then they would be asking the question rather than the traditional media. I find that an interesting idea, even if my colleagues are shut out. But I just don't see how you don't debate in this day and age. If you just want to talk to the people who think like you, how does life not get boring and elections get boring? I mean, I think they debate eventually. A lot of this is smoke. A lot of this is just smoke and mirrors, posturing.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think, in addition to not speaking to the media, not debating these things, I mean, they're real disservice to voters. Voters need that information, and it is really hard to imagine elections functioning effectively without candidates speaking to the media or debating with one another.
In the U.S. Senate race, Republican candidate Dr. Mehmet Oz had called into question whether or not his opponent, John Fetterman, was fit to serve after suffering some health troubles earlier this spring. If John Fetterman doesn't debate, does that further perpetuate those concerns about his health and his fitness to serve?
Yes. Not a lot more to say about that, but yes. I mean, a lot of times when candidates are way ahead, they will not debate in order to give their opponents publicity, to prevent their opponents from getting publicity. But in this case, the race is not that far apart, and it will certainly raise doubts about Fetterman.
One thing that stood out particularly in this U.S. Senate race has been a lot of memes, a lot of social media back and forth. Does social media popularity translate into votes in November, particularly if these folks do not debate?
Well, I mean, and I think it goes back to your previous question, and that's one of the reasons why it's devolved, I guess, to social media in a lot of ways, is because Fetterman's health has been in question, and he hasn't been out on the campaign trail, and he hasn't been talking to the media, and he hasn't been willing to put himself out in debates. And he's had a big lead, right? And so usually when you have a big lead, as Borys said, you kind of sit back and hopefully not mess it up. It's not always a good strategy, right? That's kind of what Hillary Clinton did in 2016, certainly towards the last couple of months, and that didn't work out too well for her. So I think, social media does play a big role in elections today, and I think it certainly, again, goes back to Donald Trump. In the first election in 2016, he spent incredibly a lot less money than Hillary Clinton did, and obviously ended up winning the election, and he mostly did it through social media.
Fetterman built his brand on social media, and national TV appearances. So it's a crucial part of the campaign. Shapiro, had 6 years so far as Attorney General, and that's it. So they have their kind of political brand names in Pennsylvania, and that's what Oz and Fetterman are not yet. Now, does that matter in November? We're going to find out, but that I think has a lot to do with the polling differences right now.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I do think that Fetterman's campaign has some fairly savvy people for social media. I know as far as the national attention that they've been able to get to the campaign, that's been a way that they've been able to really effectively raise money. And so for that reason alone, I think for their campaign it's worked well because it has nationalized the Pennsylvania Senate race. Even prior to people really thinking about it in that way, people were sort of seeing Fetterman as a character, and they were able to build donations based on that and continue to do so.
Harkening back to this U.S. Senate race just one more time, a common theme in the Fetterman campaign is criticizing his opponent, Dr. Oz. He says he's out of touch, and he talks a lot about how he's from New Jersey. Do voters care about where a candidate lived or for how long?
I think in Pennsylvania they do. I think in certain states they don't necessarily. I'm from New York originally. New York is famous for its carpetbaggers, like Hillary Clinton and Bobby Kennedy and such. But here in Pennsylvania, I think Pennsylvanians, when we look at Pennsylvanians, they care about people they want candidates and they want leaders who have roots here in Pennsylvania, and long and proud roots. And that's been an issue in the campaign. It was an issue in the Republican primary for Dr. Oz, even with Dave McCormick, who also had fairly shallow roots in Pennsylvania, but he had roots. But Dr. Oz basically has none, and he's a celebrity. I'm not so sure celebrity out-of-town folks. I think this is one of his disadvantages and why he hasn't really caught fire in this general elections thus far. And again, 2 months left, things could change, but that's one of the great advantages that Fetterman has, and he knows it, and that's what he's pushing, and that's what a lot of his social media posts have been on.
It matters more when your opponent is not a good candidate. And in Pennsylvania, Oz is up against a really good candidate in Fetterman. And In New York, Hillary was not up against a good candidate. Bobby Kennedy in 1964, 66 was not up against a good candidate. And, if there was a really good New Yorker who ran against either of those candidates, then there might have been a different outcome. But in Pennsylvania, Oz is a recent, move to Pennsylvania and is up against a really good candidate. I mean, that's the big difference.
3 out of 4 of our statewide candidates are currently serving in elected office. Is that serve as a benefit or a liability?
Well, I mean, as a political scientist, one of the things I'm always concerned about with candidates is experience. I mean, I do believe in, especially as folks move up into higher office, that they should have a background where they have tested their ideas and have worked with voters and have worked with legislatures if they're going to be an executive. So I think experience counts, and I think we see that when we do elect folks without experience. Of course, I think in this case you're talking about Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz is the only one that hasn't had any elected experience or government experience as a leader. And Doug Mastriano has only been in the state Senate for a few years himself. So both the Democratic candidates in this case have far more experience, government service and experience, years of it. Which again, obviously voters don't necessarily care about that in the United States because they elected Donald Trump to be president of the United States, who had absolutely no experience whatsoever in the political realm.
That's kind of the odd thing about the race. I mean, you have traditionally, especially in the last since 2016, incumbents are the targets. And then here you have two guys who are incumbents, Fetterman and Shapiro, leading their races by wide margins. It's kind of amazing.
Now, there have been some references earlier today about polls. What advice would you give our viewers and our participants about how to determine if a poll was legitimate and what to read out of a poll?
Yeah, so very good information to have. So, I mean, I think one of the things that you want to consider is timing, right? We feel like we're very close to the election. In regards to polling, we are not. Polls are going to look different. The polls that are going to be the most reliable in terms of their reflection of what we actually see are going to be the ones that are closest to the election. So that's one thing, is to keep in mind that these things are going to be moving. Also, I think it's a good idea to look at many different polls. You don't want to just be looking at one pollster because you have no sense of whether that poll is an outlier in any way. And you really need to be sort of thinking about what is kind of like the average across the polls that I'm looking at. You also want to make sure that you're looking at things like sample sizes. How many people did they actually survey for this poll? What is the margin of error? A lot of times we'll see polls presented that show, somebody's ahead, but if you look at the teeny tiny print in the corner with a margin of error, it shows you that actually we have no idea who's ahead in this race, that it could go either way. So those are just a few different things, but certainly, seeing as many polls as you possibly can, looking at the margin of error, thinking about timing, all of that matters.
Pay attention to the sample size, not just in terms of how many people they interviewed, but how that proportion represents the electorate. So if you have a state with 60% Democrats and they only poll 40% Democrats in the poll, well, that's not a very reliable poll. You want a pollster who explains his methods and says this is did we ask. We called people on their cell phones. How long? What period of time was this over? And you want something that reflects the election. Anybody who's if it's a Republican pollster, or if it's a Democratic pollster, be more skeptical because that's not an independent poll. So look for independent polls. That's why the university polls are much more, I think, reliable. And always remember that a poll, as my colleague here says, are snapshots. When things change, all the polling before the 2016 election said Hillary's an easy winner, and the polling was right. She won. She got more votes, but that's not how the system works. We have an electoral college system in America, and Donald Trump got more electoral votes. So be very, very skeptical.
And I would just add really quickly that, and I certainly agree with both, and I think, and I always tell people as a social scientist, that the interpretation of polls are just as important as the polls themselves. So, you can look at polls and interpret them differently, but, listen to the experts who are interpreting them. And, I go back to 2016, Borys is correct. The polls were right, but the interpretations were wrong.
I'd like to thank our guests today. Our panels consisted of Dr. JoyAnna Hooper, co-director of the University of Scranton Center for Ethics and Excellence in Public Service, Borys Krawczeniuk, investigative reporter for the Scranton Times-Tribune, and Jeff Brauer, professor of political science at Keystone College. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to thank the University of Scranton, its faculty and staff, for hosting today's session. And I'd like to remind our viewers that PCN will continue to cover the candidates and events leading up to Election Day on November 8th. Please continue to join us for that. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.